Blood stained the Nebraska prairie sunset red as gunfire split the evening air. The Devil's Hand gang had chosen their target poorly that day, a simple cargo car that proved to be anything but simple. They didn't know the woman they'd crossed was Sarah Freeman, the shadow that haunted Confederate nightmares. As James "Devil" McCullough raised his rifle, aiming at what he thought was just another freed slave's shipment, the barrel of a Sharps rifle emerged from behind a crate. In the fading light, he saw those eyes, the same ones that had watched his men burn 5 years ago. The legendary scout they called Shadow Walker had been waiting, and Devil McCullough's blood ran cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The name Shadow Walker wasn't given lightly. Sarah Freeman earned it through blood and gunsmoke, tracking Confederate movements through Virginia swamps when other scouts deemed them impassable. But her story began long before the war, on a cotton plantation in Georgia, where she learned her first lessons in survival. At 12, she'd memorized the overseer's patrol patterns. By 14, she could read tracks better than the plantation's hunting dogs. When Union troops pushed south in '63, she didn't just escape. She led 37 others through Confederate lines, disappearing into the night like spirits. The Yankees called it a miracle. Sarah called it mathematics, counting seconds between guard changes, calculating moonless nights, reading the weather in cricket songs. The Union Army didn't want a black woman scout at first, but desperation made strange allies, and results spoke louder than prejudice. Sarah mapped supply lines, predicted troop movements, and guided raids with uncanny precision. The Lakota scouts she worked with saw something familiar in her way of reading the land. They taught her their methods, and she merged them with her own. After the war, while other freed slaves headed north, Sarah went west. The frontier territories needed goods, and she built a trading empire from saddle leather and sharp wits. Her reputation opened doors that would have been closed to most freed slaves. Every major railroad depot from St. Louis to Cheyenne knew her mark on shipping manifests. But success drew attention. Some folks couldn't stomach seeing a black woman rise above her station, particularly those who remembered her from the war, those who'd lost land, power, and pride to Union victories she'd helped secure. They whispered about her in saloons, planned in back rooms, nursed old grudges into fresh violence. Sarah knew they were coming. She always knew. The war had taught her that survival meant staying 3 steps ahead. Her cargo trains carried more than just dry goods and farming tools. Behind false walls and hidden compartments, she kept an arsenal that would make a cavalry unit envious. Every route was planned with alternate paths. Every schedule had built-in contingencies. The rise of the Devil's Hand gang didn't surprise her. Men like James McCullough were predictable in their hatred. They targeted successful freed slaves across the territories, burning businesses, destroying shipments, leaving messages written in blood. But they were sloppy, leaving signs any decent. Tracker could read horses with Missouri shoes, ammunition from Texas suppliers, patterns in their movements. Sarah watched. She documented. She built a network of allies, former slaves, sympathetic lawmen, Native American tribes who had their own reasons to hate the gang's kind of violence. She kept ledgers of the gang's activities that would have impressed a Philadelphia accountant. Every attack, every victim, every dollar of damage, all while appearing to be nothing more than a successful merchant. Now, in the warm light of her private rail car, Sarah traced her fingers over a map marked with red dots, each one a business the gang had destroyed. Their pattern was moving west, following the railroad's expansion. Their attacks were getting bolder, their violence more brutal. The territorial marshals seemed unwilling or unable to stop them, but Sarah Freeman hadn't survived slavery, war, and the frontier's dangers by waiting for others to solve her problems. When reports came that the gang was asking questions about her shipping schedules, she didn't run. She adjusted her ledgers, sent out misleading manifests, and began laying a trap that had been years in the making. What the Devil's Hand gang saw as an opportunity, a rich target, an uppity freed slave who needed teaching a lesson, was actually the beginning of their end. They just didn't know it yet. Sarah packed her Sharps rifle with the same methodical care she'd once used to pack escape bags on the plantation. Some lessons, she mused, you never forgot, and some debts could only be paid in blood. James "Devil" McCullough ran his gang like he'd run his Confederate cavalry unit, with iron discipline and calculated cruelty. The war might have ended a decade ago, but in his mind, the fight for the proper order of things never stopped. His men were chosen carefully, former Confederate soldiers, failed homesteaders, and bitter men who blamed their misfortunes on freed slaves' success. The Devil's Hand gang had built a reputation that made grown men tremble. They didn't just rob. They sent messages. Every attack was staged to remind freed slaves of their place. Successful black-owned businesses would find their premises burned, their goods destroyed, their families threatened. The gang's calling card was a red handprint left on whatever remained standing. McCullough's network ran deep through the territories. Sheriff's deputies looked the other way when paid enough. Telegraph operators lost warnings about gang movements. Railroad workers leaked shipping schedules. The gang's true power wasn't in their guns, but in the web of corruption they'd woven through respectable society. Their latest target had come to them through one such connection, a clerk in the Kansas City Railroad office who'd noticed unusual patterns in shipping manifests. A colored woman running an unusually successful trading operation, moving goods worth thousands across the territories. The clerk's letter to McCullough dripped with indignation about the unnatural situation. In the flickering lamplight of their camp, McCullough spread out the stolen shipping schedules. His lieutenant, a scarred man called Hawkins, traced the planned route with a tobacco-stained finger. The cargo would be valuable, but that wasn't what drew McCullough's interest. It was the principle of the thing, some uppity freed slave getting rich off the expanding railroad. It wasn't right. "Boys," McCullough addressed his men, his voice carrying the soft drawl of old Virginia, "this here's more than just a robbery. This is about setting things right, showing these people that some things don't change just 'cause of some paper in Washington." His men nodded, cleaning weapons and checking ammunition. They'd done this dance before. The gang had grown to 20 strong, each man chosen for loyalty and brutality. They carried military-grade weapons, rode the best horses stolen money could buy, and knew every back trail and hideout between Missouri and the Rockies. What they didn't know, what their network of informants had failed to discover, was exactly who they were planning to rob. None of their sources had connected the successful trader Sarah Freeman with the legendary shadow walker of the Union Army. The clerk's letter had mentioned only a colored woman above her station. McCullough's planning was meticulous. He set up watches along the railroad line, arranged for sympathetic railroad workers to signal the train's approach, and prepared ambush points where the tracks curved through a shallow valley. Everything was arranged for a quick, efficient raid that would serve as an example to others. As his men bedded down for the night, McCullough sat alone by the fire, studying maps and manifests. Something nagged at the edge of his memory, a story from the war years about a black scout who'd led Union forces through Confederate lines. But he dismissed the thought. That was then, this was now. Times had changed, but the natural order hadn't. Tomorrow would prove that. The morning sun painted the Kansas City Railroad depot in shades of gold as Sarah Freeman supervised the loading of her cargo. Her eyes missed nothing. Not the new depot worker who watched too intently, not the telegraph operator's nervous glances, not the fresh hoofprints in the mud leading away from the station. 2 armed guards stood nearby, former Buffalo soldiers who'd served with distinction. Their presence wasn't unusual for valuable shipments, but these men were more than they appeared. Thomas Washington and Marcus Brown had ridden with Sarah during the war, scouting Confederate positions. They knew her methods, understood her signals, and most importantly, could read the tension in her shoulders that morning. "Manifest shows farm equipment and dry goods," Sarah announced loudly for the benefit of any listening ears. She didn't mention the false compartments, the weapons cached behind innocent-looking crates, or the extra ammunition stored in barrels marked salted pork. Among her legitimate passengers were 3 Lakota traders, their presence arranged months in advance. Swift Horse, Black Wolf, and Running Stream were more than trading partners. They were scouts who taught Sarah their ways during the war. Their eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading signs invisible to most settlers. The locomotive's whistle pierced the morning air as final preparations were made. Sarah moved through her private car, checking hidden catches and secret panels. Her fingers traced the familiar shape of her Sharps rifle, concealed but within easy reach. A Spencer repeating rifle and 2 Navy Colts were similarly hidden throughout. The car, she'd received the warnings, whispered messages from her network of allies. The Devil's Hand gang was moving west, asking questions about her shipments. Their pattern of attacks had been leading to this moment, like a noose slowly tightening. But Sarah Freeman hadn't survived this long by being prey. The train lurched into motion, steam billowing against the blue Kansas sky. In her private car, Sarah unfolded a detailed map of the territory. She'd marked every water stop, every potential ambush point, every escape route through the surrounding prairie. Her fingers traced the rail line to where it curved through a shallow valley, the perfect spot for an ambush. Thomas Washington entered the car, his voice low. Riders spotted to the north, following parallel to the tracks. Sarah nodded. The pieces were moving into place. "Tell Marcus to check the rear coupling, make sure it'll separate clean if needed." Through the window, she watched the landscape roll past. The civilized facade of Kansas City gave way to open prairie, where tall grass concealed 1,000 places for men to hide. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the tension in the air grew thicker. Swift Horse appeared at her door, his expression grave. "Smoke signals, 4 riders ahead, more behind." "They're herding us," Sarah murmured, though this was exactly what she'd expected. The gang would want to control the point of confrontation, to choose their ground. They didn't realize they were being led just as surely as they thought they were leading. The morning wore on. Sarah moved through the train, checking on her preparations while maintaining the appearance of a simple merchant. She spoke with passengers, calmed nervous mothers, and all the while kept count of the miles passing beneath the iron wheels. In her mind, she could see McCullough and his men, confident in their approach, unaware they were riding into a trap years in the making. The valley approached, and with it, the moment when paths laid down by history, hatred, and justice would finally cross. Marcus Brown brought her final confirmation. Riders closing in from both directions, armed men moving parallel to the tracks. The gang had taken the bait. Now came the dangerous part, surviving their attack long enough to spring the trap. Sarah Freeman stood at her window, watching the sun climb toward noon. Her hand rested near the hidden panel concealing her rifle, and her mind was clear. The war had taught her that victory often went to those who could see 3 moves ahead. McCullough was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The first warning came with a spray of rocks against the train's iron flanks. A deliberate rock slide, not large enough to derail but sufficient to force the engineer to slow the locomotive's pace. Steam hissed through the valley as the train's wheels ground against the rails, the cars shuddering to a reluctant halt. Shots rang out from the ridgeline, warning shots designed to create panic rather than damage. Screams erupted from the passenger cars as travelers dove for cover. Through the chaos, Sarah Freeman's voice cut clear and steady. "Everyone down, away from the windows." The Devil's Hand gang emerged from the grass like shadows taking form. 20 riders moving with military precision, their horses' hooves kicking up dust in the prairie sun. At their head rode James McCullough, a red bandana marking him as the Devil himself. "This here train is now under new management." McCullough's voice boomed across the valley. "Nobody needs to die today, lest they choose to be heroic." Sarah watched through a gap in the window curtains as the gang surrounded the train. Their positions betrayed their experience, covered all angles of escape, maintained clear lines of fire. These weren't common bandits. These were trained soldiers playing at being outlaws. Thomas Washington and Marcus Brown had already moved to their predetermined positions. The Lakota traders melted away among the passengers, their presence now invisible but deadly. Sarah's hand found the hidden catch that would reveal her Sharps rifle. The first gang members approached the cargo car, confident in their superiority of numbers. They didn't notice the slight irregularities in the car's construction, the subtle signs of reinforcement, the carefully positioned gun ports disguised as ventilation holes. "Ma'am," McCullough called out, his voice carrying a mockery of politeness, "we here tell this here's your shipment. Now, being a reasonable man, I'm offering you the chance to surrender peaceful-like. Save everyone a heap of trouble." Sarah's response was measured, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "Mr. McCullough, I'm offering you the same courtesy. Ride away now, and we can avoid unnecessary bloodshed." The use of his name stopped McCullough cold. His men stirred uneasily, hands tightening on their weapons. The game had changed. Their target knew them, had expected them. "Now how does a simple trader know my name?" McCullough's drawl carried an edge of steel now. He urged his horse closer to the train, studying the cars with new wariness. Movement caught his eye, a glint of metal from a ventilation hole. His war-trained instincts screamed danger, but before he could shout a warning, the first shot rang out. Not from his men, but from the train. A gang member toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted. The gang opened fire, their bullets pinging off reinforced walls, but they were shooting blind, while every shot from the train found its mark. From hidden positions, the Lakota traders began picking off outlaws with deadly accuracy. Sarah's voice carried over the gunfire, calm as a summer morning. "That was your second warning, McCullough. There won't be a third." The gang leader's face transformed from confidence to rage as recognition finally dawned. "Shadow Walker!" He spat the name like a curse. "Should have known. Boys, this here's the witch that burned our supply lines in Virginia." But his men were already falling back, shaken by the precision of the defense. What they'd thought would be an easy raid had turned into an ambush, with them as the targets. McCullough's carefully planned attack was unraveling, and with it, the myth of the Devil's Hand gang's invincibility. Through the gunsmoke, Sarah Freeman watched McCullough's face contort with the realization that he'd led his men into a trap. The hunter had become the hunted, and the real battle was just beginning. McCullough's mind raced back to that night in Virginia, 1864. The moon had been full, casting silver light over his Confederate supply depot. His men had been confident, laughing around campfires, sure that no Union force could find them in the tangled backwater swamps. Then the fires had erupted, ammunition cooking off like Independence Day fireworks, horses screaming in the night. They never saw their attackers. Just shadows moving through smoke, precise shots dropping sentries without a sound. When they finally caught one of the raiders, a young black woman who'd moved like a ghost, she'd smiled even as they threatened her with hanging. The next morning, she was gone, along with 3 more supply wagons and their best horses. Now, 11 years later, those same knowing eyes watched him from the train. "Fall back!" McCullough bellowed, but his voice cracked. His men sensed the change in him, the fear that edged his commands. They'd never heard that tone from their leader before. Sarah's voice carried across the battlefield, steady as a church bell. Your men deserve to know who they're fighting, McCullough. Tell them about the night you lost your command. Tell them why they call me Shadow Walker." The gang members looked between their leader and the train, confusion mixing with growing dread. Another shot rang out, dropping a man who'd been trying to flank the passenger cars. The bullet had come from somewhere in the tall grass, impossible to tell where. "She ain't just some trader," McCullough spat, his face twisted with old hatred. "She's that witch that led Union raiders through Confederate lines. Cost us supply lines from Richmond to Atlanta." Hawkins, his lieutenant, went pale. The one they said could track a fish through water, the scout that ghosted through 3 blockades. More shots, more precise than any random fire should be. The gang's confident assault had transformed into confused chaos. They'd come expecting to terrorize a black merchant woman. Instead, they faced a legend who'd helped break the back of the Confederacy. "Your reputation's grown, Shadow Walker," McCullough called out, trying to mask his uncertainty with bravado. "But you're still outnumbered." Sarah's laugh carried clear and cold. "Count again, Devil. Your men are dying or running, and my friends haven't even shown themselves yet." As if summoned by her words, war cries echoed from the ridgeline. Lakota warriors appeared on horseback, their weapons gleaming. More figures emerged from among the passengers, freed slaves turned fighters, each one bearing the hard-earned skill of survival. The Devil's Hand Gang's remaining members looked to McCullough with questioning eyes. The iron discipline that had held them together was cracking. They'd signed up to terrorize helpless victims, not face a military legend backed by native warriors. "You had your chance to ride away." Sarah's voice held no mercy now. "You chose to make this personal, again." The memory of defeat burned in McCullough's gut. This woman had humiliated him once before, cost him his command, his reputation, everything. He'd built in the Confederate Army. He'd spent years rebuilding his power through terror and violence, and now she threatened to take it all away again. "Shoot the windows," he screamed, desperation replacing strategy. "Burn the whole damn train." But his men's nerve was breaking. They'd seen too many of their companions fall to unseen shooters. The legend of Shadow Walker had come alive before them, and it was hungry for blood. One by one, they began to pull back, trying to fade into the grass like their victims had so often done. McCullough watched his authority dissolve like morning mist, and with it, his dreams of restoring the old order. Sarah Freeman stood in her reinforced car, watching the gang scatter. She'd waited years for this moment, planned for every contingency. But as she saw the fear in McCullough's eyes, she knew this was just the beginning. The real battle would come when he realized just how thoroughly she'd prepared for this day. The Nebraska prairie turned treacherous as the Devil's Hand Gang scattered like quail before a storm. But Sarah Freeman hadn't spent years tracking Confederate forces through Virginia swamps to let her prey escape now. She emerged from the train's armored car with the practiced grace of a hunter, her Sharps rifle cradled in weathered hands. "Thomas, Marcus, secure the passengers," she commanded. "Swift Horse, which way is the main group headed?" The Lakota scout pointed northwest toward a distant line of cottonwoods. They split into 3 groups. The Devil rides with 6 others. They leave deep tracks, carrying heavy supplies. Sarah nodded, reading the signs herself. McCullough was weighed down by ammunition and stolen gold from previous raids. He'd head for one of his hidden camps, probably the old mining shaft near the Kansas border. His men would try to draw pursuit away from him, but they'd made a crucial mistake. "Running Stream," she called to another of her Lakota allies. "Take your warriors east. There's a gang camp in the bluffs. Burn it. Black Wolf, sweep west, and alert the territorial marshal at Fort Hays. I want McCullough's escape routes closed." The prairie came alive with movement. Lakota warriors rode out in precise formation, their ponies kicking up dust clouds that would make the gang think a larger force pursued them. Sarah's network, built painstakingly over years, was finally moving into action. Territory Marshal James. Wilson arrived with a dozen deputies, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. His weathered face showed concern. "Miss Freeman, we got your telegraph about the gang, but this is mighty risky, pursuing them into open country." "Marshal," Sarah's voice carried the authority of hard experience, "I've been hunting these men. Since before they became the Devil's Hand, I've documented every raid, every murder, every theft. That packet I sent to your office last week, names, dates, locations, enough to hang McCullough 10 times over." The marshal's deputies shifted uncomfortably. Some had taken bribes to look the other way during previous gang activities. They didn't. No, Sarah had proof of their corruption too, evidence she'd release if they interfered now. The first casualties of the chase were already being counted. 2 gang members lay dead in the grass, victims of precise shots from the train. 3 more were wounded, left behind by their fleeing companions. Sarah's people treated their injuries. She wasn't McCullough to leave men to die on the prairie. Thomas. Washington rode up, his horse lathered with sweat. Found their supply cache half a mile back. They were planning to resupply after the raid. Got maps, ammunition, enough food for weeks. Sarah studied the captured maps. They confirmed her suspicions. The gang had supply points scattered across 3 territories. This hadn't been just another raid. They'd been preparing for something bigger. A shot echoed from the northwest, followed by distant shouts. The gang was fighting among themselves now, discipline crumbling as fear took hold. Sarah had seen it before. Men who were brave while terrorizing. The helpless turned on each other when faced with real resistance. "They're making for Blackwater Creek," Swift Horse reported, returning from a quick scout. "The devil drives his men hard, 3 horses already fallen." Sarah checked her ammunition, the familiar weight of the Sharps rifle comfortable in her hands. The weapon had served her well during the war, and now it would help her finish what began in those Virginia swamps. "Marshal Wilson," she addressed the lawman, "I need your men to cover the eastern approaches. When McCullough realizes he's being herded, he'll try to double back through familiar territory." The marshal nodded, grateful to have clear direction. His men spread out, their movements showing military training. Most had served in the Union Army during the war. As Sarah mounted her horse, she felt the familiar tension of a hunt beginning. But this was more than pursuit. It was the culmination of years of planning, of building alliances, of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The prairie stretched before her, a sea of grass where a skilled tracker could read stories in every bent blade. Somewhere ahead, McCullough rode with his dwindling band of loyalists, his dreams of power turning to dust in the Nebraska wind. The real hunt was about to begin. The sun dipped toward the horizon as riders spread across the Nebraska territory like ripples in a pond. In every town and settlement, messages passed through hands Sarah Freeman had cultivated for years. Former slaves who'd built new lives in the West, Union veterans who remembered the Shadow Scout from Virginia, Native Americans who respected her adherence to their ways. In the town of Blue Creek, Sheriff Daniel Morton received a sealed letter from a breathless courier. His face darkened as he read it, then he began shouting orders. "Get those deputies who've been dragging their feet on the gang's activities. Time to choose sides." 50 miles east, in a Lakota camp, runners brought news that set another piece of Sarah's plan in motion. Warriors who owed her blood debts mounted up, their weapons ready. They remembered how she'd helped their people during harsh winters, trading fair when others cheated them. Down in Republican City, banker Thomas Hayes opened his safe with trembling hands. For years he'd been laundering the Devil's Hand gang's stolen money. Now a telegram sat on his desk. "Your assistance to McCullough is documented. Redemption available if acted upon immediately." It was signed with Sarah's trading mark. The gang's supposedly secret routes were suddenly blocked by fallen trees or washed-out bridges. Their hidden caches of supplies and ammunition were found empty or under watch. Every ally they'd bought, with terror or gold, received the same message: stand with the gang and fall with them, or help bring them down. McCullough's remaining men felt the noose tightening. At their camp near Blackwater Creek, Hawkins approached his leader with growing desperation. "Devil, our friends in Lawrence won't help. Same in Concordia. It's like every rat in the territory got the same warning." McCullough's face was a mask of fury as he watched another of his men desert in the night. "She's been planning this for years," he spat. "Every deal we made, every man we bought. She was watching, waiting." A rider approached their camp at full gallop, one of their scouts. "Marshall's deputies at Carson's Crossing, and not the ones we paid off. New men, Union veterans by the look of them." The gang's world was shrinking. Traditional escape routes were closed. Friendly towns suddenly hostile. Sarah Freeman had turned their own network against them, using their corruption as a weapon. In the territorial capital, Judge William Harper sat at his desk, staring at documents that proved his complicity in the gang's activities. The evidence had arrived by special courier, along with a simple choice: issue warrants for every corrupt official named in the papers, or see his own crimes exposed. Sarah rode through the gathering dusk, swift horse at her side. The Lakota scout pointed to signs only experienced trackers could read. They run like wounded buffalo now, without direction. Their spirit is broken. But Sarah knew McCullough too well to think him beaten yet. Desperate men were the most dangerous, and the Devil's Hand leader had nothing left to lose. "He'll make for Fort Wallace," she said. "It's his last bolt hole with friends in place." What McCullough didn't know was that Sarah had saved her strongest card for last. In her saddlebag was a letter from the United States Marshal Service in Washington, authorizing her as a special deputy. Everything she'd documented about the gang's activities, every murder, every theft, every act of corruption, was now official federal evidence. The sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In towns across the territory, lamps burned late as choices were made, sides chosen, and old debts called due. Sarah Freeman's web, woven with patience and cunning, was drawing tight around her prey. And somewhere in the darkness, McCullough rode with his dwindling band, feeling the weight of years of arrogance and cruelty finally coming due. The woman he'd once dismissed as just another freed slave had built an empire while he wasn't looking. Now that empire was bringing him down, piece by piece, ally by ally, escape route by escape route. The night wind carried the sound of hoofbeats from all directions, as if the very territory itself had turned against the Devil's Hand gang. Their reign of terror was ending, not with a glorious last stand, but with the slow, inexorable closing of every door, every option, every hope of escape. Night settled over the Nebraska territory like a burial shroud. The Devil's Hand gang, once 20 strong, was now reduced to 8 desperate men. They made camp in a shallow ravine, their horses worn and their spirits broken. Every shadow in the darkness seemed to hide one of Shadow Walker's allies. McCullough posted guards, but it didn't matter. The night belonged to Sarah Freeman. She moved through the tall grass like a ghost, her years of experience making her virtually invisible. The first guard never saw her approach. A quick blow with a rifle butt, and he slumped silently to the ground. Swift horse materialized beside her, his voice barely a whisper. 2 more guards on the ridge line. The others sleep fitfully. Their horses are failing. Sarah nodded, remembering similar nights during the war when she'd stalked Confederate camps. But this was different. These men had chosen their path, chosen to prey on the innocent, chosen to cling to a dead world where they held power through fear. The gang's camp fell silent, except for the pop and crackle of their small fire. Then the night exploded into chaos. War cries echoed from all directions as mounted Lakota warriors charged through the darkness, firing shots into the air. The gang scrambled for weapons, shooting blindly at shadows. "They're everywhere!" One of McCullough's men screamed, his nerve breaking. He mounted his horse and fled into the darkness. The sound of a single shot rang out, followed by the thud of a body hitting the ground. Sarah's aim hadn't suffered over the years. McCullough shouted orders, trying to rally his men, but the terror they'd so often inspired in others now turned back on them. Shadows seemed to move with purpose in the firelight. Every rustle of grass could be death approaching. Another gang member broke and ran. This time, Sarah let him go. He'd ride straight into Marshal Wilson's waiting deputies. The net was drawing tighter with each passing hour. By dawn, 3 more of McCullough's men had fallen to precise shots from unseen rifles. The remaining 4, including McCullough and Hawkins, rode hard for Fort Wallace, their last hope of sanctuary. But even here, Sarah's influence had preceded them. They found the fort's gates closed, rifles aimed from the walls. The commander, a Union veteran who remembered Shadow Walker's service, had already chosen his side. McCullough's curses echoed across the prairie as they were forced to turn east toward even more dangerous territory. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as the gang passed below her hidden position. She could have ended it there, but that wasn't her plan. McCullough needed to be taken alive, to face justice for all his crimes. His death would only make him a martyr to others who shared his hateful beliefs. The day wore on, and Sarah's allies continued their relentless pursuit. Thomas, Washington and Marcus Brown led a group of freed men who'd once been slaves, now turned hunters. They drove the gang away from water sources, forced them to abandon their heavy supplies, and slowly wore down their resistance. Lakota warriors appeared and disappeared like prairie spirits, striking from unexpected directions, never offering a clear target. The gang's military discipline crumbled under the psychological warfare. They started seeing enemies in every shadow, hearing pursuit in every wind rustle. By sunset, Hawkins had taken a bullet in the shoulder. Another gang member's horse went lame, forcing him to surrender. McCullough and his last loyal man pushed on, but their mounts were stumbling with exhaustion. Sarah Freeman stood on a ridge, watching the sun paint the sky crimson. She'd waited years for this hunt, planned it meticulously, built her network with patience and cunning. Now McCullough was learning what it meant to be prey, to feel the helplessness his victims had felt. The night would bring another lesson, as Sarah's people closed in from all sides. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and the Devil's Hand was about to learn why they called her Shadow Walker. Territory Marshal James Wilson sat in his Fort Hays office, staring at the documents spread across his desk. Sarah Freeman's evidence was undeniable. Detailed records of bribes, witness statements, bank transfers that linked half his deputies to the Devil's Hand gang. The corruption ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. "Sir!" Deputy Marshal Thompson stood in the doorway, nervous tension visible in his stance. "We got word. McCullough's heading for the Silver Creek station. Jenkins and his boys are stationed there." Wilson's jaw tightened. Jenkins was one of the corrupted deputies, bought by McCullough years ago. If the gang reached Silver Creek, they'd find fresh horses and armed allies waiting. "Get me every deputy you trust completely," Wilson ordered, standing to strap on his gun belt. "And send a rider to Sarah Freeman. Tell her it's time." The marshal's office erupted into activity. Men who'd served together for years now eyed each other with suspicion. Wilson watched as his force divided itself, those who stood for law, and those who'd sold their badges to the devil. Sarah received the message as she tracked McCullough's desperate flight. Her network had already identified every corrupt lawman in 3 territories, but she'd waited for Wilson to make this choice himself. A marshal's authority would make the coming justice official. At Silver Creek Station, Deputy Jenkins paced nervously. His last message from McCullough had promised gold for help in escaping the territory, but now Sarah Freeman's warning haunted him. Every man who stands with the devil's hand will fall with them. Thunder rolled across the prairie, not from the clear sky, but from approaching riders. Marshal Wilson led 24 deputies towards Silver Creek, their badges catching the morning sun. Behind them rode Sarah Freeman with her own force, Buffalo soldiers, Lakota warriors, and freedmen united in purpose. Jenkins and his corrupt deputies faced a choice that would echo across the territory: stand with McCullough and face federal charges, or surrender their badges and testify against the gang. "This ain't about some railroad robbery gone wrong," Wilson addressed his assembled men. "Miss Freeman's evidence proves the Devil's Hand Gang has murdered 38 people, burned 16 businesses owned by freed slaves, stolen thousands in army payrolls. Any man who helps them escape is equally guilty of these crimes." Sarah sat her horse beside the marshal, her presence a silent reminder of justice long delayed. But finally at hand, the Sharp's rifle across her saddle had helped break the Confederacy. Now it would help break this last remnant of that dead world. One by one, corrupt deputies surrendered their badges. Jenkins lasted longest, defiance warring with fear on his face. But when Sarah produced documents showing his involvement in 3 murders, his resistance crumbled. Marshal Wilson deputized Sarah's allies, making their pursuit officially sanctioned. The territory's law enforcement was being cleansed, reforged in the fire of this hunt. Men who'd hidden their corruption behind badges were now facing the same justice they'd sworn to uphold. The truth emerged like a corpse rising from a shallow grave. As Sarah's allies searched the gang's abandoned camps, they found more than ammunition and supplies. They found letters, journals, and orders dating back to the Civil War, evidence of atrocities that McCullough had tried to bury in the blood-soaked soil of history. In his Virginia command post, 1864, Lieutenant Colonel James McCullough hadn't just been a Confederate officer. He'd led a special unit tasked with hunting down escaped slaves who aided the Union Army. His methods had earned him the nickname Devil long before his gang adopted the title. Sarah Freeman sat in her camp, reading captured documents by lamplight. The pages confirmed what she'd known, but could never prove during the war. McCullough's unit had burned entire slave quarters, executed suspected Union sympathizers, and committed acts that violated even the loose rules of Civil War combat. 5 colored scouts captured near Richmond, she read from a yellowed report. Interrogated and disposed of as per standing orders. Her hands trembled. Those had been her friends, her fellow scouts, people she'd trained with. Swift Horse watched her face darken as she read. "This is personal for you, Shadow Walker. More than just the gang's crimes." December 1864, Sarah continued, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Discovered unauthorized school for Negro children on Whitman Plantation. Structure burned. Example made of teacher." She looked up at Swift Horse. "That teacher was my sister. I never knew what happened to her until now." The documents painted a picture of systematic cruelty that had continued long after the wars. McCullough had transformed his military unit into the Devil's Hand Gang, targeting successful freed slaves across the territories. Each attack was meant to send a message. Freedom was an illusion that could be revoked with enough violence. Marshal Wilson arrived as Sarah was organizing the evidence. His face grew grimmer with each report he read. "This goes beyond territory law," he said finally. "These are federal crimes, war crimes even. Washington will want him alive." "Alive," Sarah agreed, though her trigger finger itched. "The dead can't testify, can't name their conspirators, can't face their victims' families in court." Word of McCullough's true nature spread through the hunting party. Buffalo soldiers who'd fought in the war recognized names in the reports, places, dates, atrocities that had gone unpunished. Their determination hardened into something deeper than duty. The Lakota warriors, too, understood the weight of old. Wrongs finally brought to light. Their own people had suffered from men like McCullough, who saw anyone different as less than human. More riders arrived throughout the day. Lawmen from other territories, army officers with federal warrants, even a reporter from Harper's Weekly who'd been investigating the gang's activities. Sarah's meticulous documentation was becoming a noose around McCullough's neck. In their desperate flight, McCullough and his remaining man made a fatal mistake. They rode into Broken Bow, a town Sarah's network had warned about the gang's approach. The saloon keeper recognized them, remembered how they'd burned out a black family's homestead the year before. The telegraph wires hummed with the news. Marshal Wilson mobilized his reformed police force. Sarah gathered her allies. The Devil's past had finally caught up with him, and judgment was riding hard on his trail. As night fell over the territory, Sarah Freeman cleaned her Sharps rifle with practiced care. The weapon had helped her survive McCullough's hunters during the war. Now it would help bring him to justice. The Devil's long reign of terror was about to end, not with the bang of gunfire, but with the cold certainty of law and testimony. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. But tonight, the ghosts of McCullough's victims, Sarah's sister among them, seemed to ride with the Broken Bow transformed from a quiet frontier town into an armed camp as allies gathered under the autumn sky. Former slaves who'd built new lives in the West stood shoulder to shoulder with Lakota warriors. Buffalo soldiers in faded blue uniforms shared coffee with territorial deputies. Union veterans who remembered Shadow Walker's service arrived hourly, drawn by the chance to finish what the war had started. Sarah Freeman moved among them, each group part of the web she'd woven over. Years of patient planning. To the freedmen, she was living proof that their people could rise above their chains. To the Lakota, she was a warrior who respected their ways and kept her word. To the lawmen, she represented justice too long delayed. "My people count 40. Rifles," Swift Horse reported, returning from a scout. "More coming from the north. The Pawnee remember how you helped during the fever winter. They ride with us now." Marshal Wilson studied the growing force with professional appreciation. "Never seen anything like this. Black, white, Indian, all working together. McCullough's spent years turning folks against each other. Now that same hatred's brought them together against him." Sarah's organization showed in every detail. Supply wagons arrived with ammunition and provisions. Messengers maintained communication between scattered groups. Medical stations were established, with both white and native healers sharing knowledge. A group of freed slaves arrived from Kansas, led by a tall man with graying hair. "Name's John Freeman," he announced to Sarah. "No relation, but I remember when you helped my family escape north. Reckon it's time to repay that debt." The Lakota chiefs held council as the sun set, their discussion punctuated by the arrival of more warriors. They had their own scores to settle with McCullough's gang, who'd raided their hunting grounds and blamed the attacks on other tribes. "The spirits of the land reject him," declared Chief Running Cloud after the council. "We will help drive this evil from our territory." As night fell, Sarah called her key allies together in the town hall. Maps covered the walls, showing every trail, water source, and potential escape route in 4 territories. Her network had spent years marking McCullough's hiding places and safe houses. Now that knowledge would become a trap. "He's running for the Kansas border," she explained, tracing the likely route. "He's got friends in Dodge City, thinks they'll hide him. But every station, every town between here and there is watched. He'll find no shelter, no rest, no escape." Thomas Washington, the former Buffalo soldier, spoke up. "What about his friends in high places? Man like that's bound to have powerful allies." Sarah smiled grimly. "Already handled. Marshal Wilson's deputies are arresting corrupt officials across 3 territories. Judges, bankers, politicians, anyone who helped the gang is facing federal charges. McCullough's world is shrinking by the hour. The meeting continued into the night as Sarah assigned positions and coordinated movements. Each group had its role. The Lakota would track, the Buffalo Soldiers would pursue, the territorial deputies would block escape routes, and the freedmen would guard the towns along McCullough's path. Dawn brought more allies. A company of U.S. cavalry arrived, led by a captain who carried orders from Washington itself. The Devil's Hand Gang was now a federal matter, their crimes elevated beyond mere territory law. Sarah Freeman stood on the town hall steps, watching her diverse army prepare for the coming hunt. This was more than pursuit. It was a reckoning, a statement that the old hatreds McCullough represented had no place in the new West. The morning sun painted the prairie gold as riders moved out in precise formation. Lakota scouts ranged ahead, Buffalo Soldiers and cavalrymen formed the main force, and territorial deputies secured the flanks. Years of planning, of building trust and gathering evidence had led to this moment. The Devil was about to learn that the very divisions he'd exploited had become his undoing. The hunter who'd terrorized the weak was about to face the combined strength of all those he'd wronged, and leading them rode Shadow Walker, the freed slave he'd dismissed, now become the architect of his destruction. The betrayal came with the setting sun. Deputy Marshal Thompson, who'd stood at Wilson's right hand throughout the pursuit, made his move as the hunting party closed in on McCullough's position. The shot came from behind, catching Sarah Freeman in the left shoulder as she studied tracks in the fading light. The carefully orchestrated pursuit dissolved into chaos. Thompson had positioned trusted men, all secretly in McCullough's pay, at key points in the formation. As Sarah fell, they opened fire on their fellow lawmen, creating gaps in the line that would allow the gang leader to slip through. "Been working for the Devil for years," Thompson shouted, aiming for another shot at Sarah. "Paid better than a marshal's wage, and he promised me Nebraska territory when all this was done." Swift Horse's arrow took Thompson in the gun arm before he could fire again. The deputy marshal's scream echoed across the prairie, but the damage was done. McCullough's last gambit had struck deep at the heart of Sarah's alliance. Through the pain of her wound, Sarah's mind raced. Thompson had been in every strategy meeting, knew all their positions, their plans. Even now, riders were spreading confusion through the pursuit parties, leading them down false trails with counterfeit orders. "Get me up," she ordered Thomas, Washington, who'd run to her aid. "Can't let them see Shadow Walker fall." Blood soaked her shirt as Washington helped her mount. Around them, the pursuit force struggled to reorganize. Trust, so carefully built over the past days, now turned to suspicion. Every order was questioned, every movement second-guessed. Marcus Brown rode up, his horse lathered. "4 more deputies," and turned. "Killed 2 of our scouts before we knew what was happening. McCullough's heading for the Kansas border, and half our blocking forces are compromised." Sarah's eyes narrowed against the pain. Thompson's betrayal wasn't random desperation. It was McCullough's style. Create chaos, turn allies against each other, then slip away in the confusion. She'd seen him use the same tactics during the war. But the Devil had underestimated her again. Sarah Freeman hadn't survived slavery and war by trusting easily. Every man in her inner circle had been tested, had proven their loyalty long before this hunt began. And she'd prepared for betrayal. "Marcus," she called, her voice steady despite the wound. "Send the signal." Brown raised a silver whistle to his lips, blowing a pattern that echoed across the darkening prairie. In response, fire arrows soared. Into the sky from hidden positions, Sarah's real blocking force, positioned days ago. The Lakota warriors who'd seemed to ride with the main group were only half her available strength. The others had been moving parallel to the pursuit, invisible, in The tall grass, waiting for exactly this moment. Now they emerged like spirits from the gathering darkness, their war cries filling the air. Thompson's co-conspirators found themselves suddenly surrounded, cut off from both escape and their master. "You think I didn't know?" Sarah's voice carried across the battlefield, strong despite her injury. Every man Thompson recruited, every message he sent to McCullough, every dollar that passed between them, all documented, all part of the plan. The wounded deputy marshal's face drained of color as riders emerged from hidden positions throughout the pursuit line. These weren't lawmen or soldiers, but freedmen and Lakota warriors who'd never appeared on the official rolls. Sarah's real force had been invisible, waiting for the traitors to reveal themselves. "Your master's not the only one who can play with shadows," Sarah told the captured conspirators. "I learned deception from the best, from men like him who thought they could own people, break people, use people as pawns." Marshal Wilson rode up, his face dark with fury at the betrayal of his men. But Sarah raised a hand to stop his angry words. "These men are federal witnesses now. They'll tell us everything about McCullough's network, or they'll hang as traitors to their badges." Thompson broke first, proving that men who betrayed for money rarely held firm when death looked them in the eye. "The devil's heading for Dodge City," he gasped, clutching his wounded arm, but not by the main roads. "He's got a hidden trail through Indian territory, marked by old Confederate signs." Sarah nodded, having expected this. McCullough was falling back on his military experience, using trails and markers left over from the war. But even this played into her hands. After all, who knew Confederate codes better than the scout who'd helped break them? "Get me bandaged," she ordered Washington. "We move in 10 minutes. "But your wound," he started to protest. "Is nothing compared to what others have suffered at McCullough's hands," she finished. "I didn't come this far to let a little blood stop me." As her allies treated her shoulder, Sarah watched the captured traitors being disarmed and bound. Everything was proceeding according to her deeper strategy. Let McCullough think his betrayal had wounded her, had scattered her forces. Let him believe he'd bought himself time and space to escape. The devil was about to learn that Shadow Walker's plans ran deeper than any man's betrayal could break. His own desperation had just stripped him of his last hidden allies, forcing him onto a path that would lead straight into Sarah Freeman's true trap. Night settled over the prairie as riders regrouped under new commands. The hunt was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its deadliest phase. In Sarah Freeman's saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, lay a document that would change everything. As she sat by the campfire, her wounded shoulder freshly bandaged, she finally broke the seal. Marshal Wilson and her core allies gathered close as she unfolded papers bearing the seal of the United States War Department. "By order of the Secretary of War," she read, her voice steady, "Sarah Freeman is hereby commissioned as Special Agent of the Bureau of Military Intelligence, tasked with the investigation and apprehension of Confederate insurgents operating in the Western Territories." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Swift Horse was the first to understand. "You were never just a scout," he said softly, "even during the war." Sarah nodded, passing more documents to Marshal Wilson. "The Devil's Handgang isn't just about robbery and terror. They're part of a larger organization. Former Confederates trying to build a new power base in the West. McCullough's their military arm, but there are others. Politicians, judges, businessmen, all working to recreate the world they lost." The documents laid bare a conspiracy that stretched from Washington to San Francisco. The gang's attacks on freed slaves weren't random acts of hatred. They were part of a systematic campaign to prevent Black Americans from gaining economic and political power in the new territories. "That's why you built your trading empire," Thomas Washington realized. It wasn't just about success. It was about creating a network that could watch them, track them, catch them in the act. Every route I traded, every contact I made, every ally I gathered, all part of a larger mission, Sarah confirmed. The War Department needed evidence that would stand up in federal court. Names, dates, financial records, witness testimony. I've spent years building a case that even sympathetic judges couldn't dismiss. Marcus Brown whistled softly, and McCullough never suspected, too proud to think a freed slave could be a federal agent. Their pride makes them blind, Sarah said, checking her wound dressing. They can't imagine us as anything but servants or savages. That's why they never saw the trap, until it was too late. The implications slowly dawned on her allies. Every step of the pursuit had been choreographed, not just to catch McCullough, but to expose his entire organization. The corrupted deputies, the compromised officials, the hidden money trails, all now documented by federal witnesses. The telegraph lines have been busy, Marshal Wilson reported. Federal marshals are making arrests across 3 territories. Judges, bankers, territorial officials, all named in your evidence. McCullough's not just running from us now. He's running from the full power of the United States government. Sarah's hand rested on her Sharps rifle. He's also running towards something. Those Confederate trails he's following, they lead to more than just Dodge City. There's a meeting planned, the last gathering of their leadership trying to salvage what they can of their operation. Swift Horse's eyes narrowed. You want him to reach this meeting? With us right behind him, Sarah confirmed. McCullough's desperation will make him sloppy. He'll lead us right to them. And when he does... She didn't need to finish. Her allies understood. This wasn't just about bringing down one gang leader. It was about cutting out a cancer that threatened to poison the entire West with the same hatreds that had torn the nation apart. That's why you needed all of us, Thomas Washington said. Not just to catch him, but to show them their time is past, that the future belongs to all people working together. Sarah stood, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. The moon was rising over the prairie, and somewhere ahead, McCullough was riding hard for what he thought was sanctuary. He didn't realize he was just another pawn in a game that had been years in the playing. Shadow Walker had become more than a scout. She was an agent of change, backed by the full authority of the government she'd helped preserve. And the devil was about to learn that his worst nightmare, a freed slave with power, was just the beginning of his reckoning. Nature itself seemed to sense the coming storm. Dark clouds gathered over the Kansas border, and distant thunder rolled across the prairie like artillery fire. McCullough and his last loyal man pushed their exhausted horses toward a low line of hills where the old Confederate trails promised escape. Behind them, Sarah Freeman led her forces in a pursuit formation learned from both Union cavalry and Lakota hunters. Her wound throbbed with each hoofbeat, but her eyes never left the trail. Swift Horse rode beside her, reading signs that grew fresher with each passing mile. They're pushing their horses too hard, the Lakota scout reported. Won't make 20 more miles at this pace. Sarah nodded, noting how the tracks showed the animal's growing exhaustion. He'll have fresh mounts waiting, probably weapons and supplies too. These old Confederate routes were built for exactly this purpose. The storm clouds grew darker as the chase continued. Marshal Wilson's reformed deputies spread out in a wide arc, covering any potential escape routes. The Lakota warriors moved, like shadows through the grass, their knowledge of the land letting them parallel the main force without being seen. "Rider coming!" The warning came from Thomas Washington, who'd spotted a dust cloud approaching from the east. The rider proved to be one of Sarah's railroad agents, his horse lathered with sweat. "Message from Dodge City," he gasped. The meeting's confirmed. 20 of the organization's leaders gathering at the Cross T Ranch. They're expecting McCullough before midnight. Thunder cracked overhead as Sarah processed this information. The Cross T Ranch, owned by a former Confederate colonel who'd grown rich in the cattle trade. The perfect place for conspirators to gather, hidden behind the legitimacy of business. "Signal the cavalry units," she ordered. "Have them swing wide around the ranch. No one enters or leaves once the meeting starts." Rain began to fall, fat drops that kicked up dust from the drought-hardened prairie. Sarah's shoulder wound burned, but she welcomed the pain. It kept her focused, reminded her of everything that had led to this moment. Through the growing storm, they caught glimpses of their quarry. McCullough and his remaining man were visible briefly on ridgelines, pushing their mounts mercilessly toward some destination only they could see. But Sarah knew these lands better than they did. Every wash, every ravine, every potential hiding place had been mapped and marked by her network over years of preparation. 3 riders ahead, Swift Horse's warning cut through the rain. "Moving. To intercept McCullough!" Sarah's heart raced. This wasn't part of the plan. Through her field glasses, she spotted the riders, hard-looking men wearing Confederate grey rain slickers, more of the organization's soldiers trying to protect their investment in McCullough. "Washington, Brown," she barked. "Take them." Her former Buffalo soldiers spurred their horses forward, rifles ready. The Confederate riders opened fire, but the rain spoiled their aim. Washington and Brown returned fire with military precision, dropping 2 of the riders. The third wheeled his horse and fled into the storm. The gunfire spooked McCullough's already exhausted horses. Through the curtain of rain, Sarah saw the gang leader fighting to control his mount as it reared in panic. His last loyal man wasn't. So lucky, his horse stumbled, throwing him hard onto the rain-slicked ground. "He's alone now," Swift Horse said, satisfaction in his voice. "The devil runs without friends." But Sarah knew better. McCullough was never more dangerous than when cornered. The rain grew heavier, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. Perfect conditions for a desperate man to try something reckless. Marshal Wilson rode up, water streaming from his hat brim. "My men have the approaches to Cross T Ranch covered. Cavalry units are in position. He's got nowhere left to run." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the prairie in stark white flashes. In those moments, they could see McCullough's solitary figure ahead, still pushing toward his goal. The devil was making his last ride, driving straight into the trap Sarah had spent years preparing. The storm's fury matched the tension building among the pursuers. Everything had led to this. Years of planning, countless miles of tracking, a web of allies and informants all focused on this single night. The thunder rolled again, nature's drums beating out a rhythm of approaching justice. Sarah Freeman sat straight in her saddle despite her wound, the Sharp's rifle secure in its scabbard. Before this storm cleared, she would finish what began in those Virginia swamps so many years ago. The devil's long reign of terror was about to meet its reckoning, in rain and thunder and the cold justice of the law. Lightning revealed the Cross T Ranch through sheets of rain, a fortress-like main house surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. McCullough's exhausted horse stumbled through the mud toward it, steam rising from its heaving flanks. The devil himself was soaked to the bone, his legendary red bandana now a darker shade of blood. Inside the ranch house, 20 of the most powerful men in the territories waited with growing unease. Judges who'd dismissed cases against the gang, bankers who'd laundered their stolen money, politicians who'd protected them in exchange for gold and favors. They'd come expecting to plan their next moves. Instead, they were about to become trapped. Rats McCullough practically fell from his horse at the ranch house steps. "Freeman!" he shouted through the storm. "Shadow Walker's coming! And she's not just some scout, she's federal!" The news hit the gathering like a physical blow. Men who'd built empires on corruption began to panic, realizing too late that they'd walked into a trap. Some ran for their horses, only to hear gunfire in the darkness. Sarah's forces had the ranch surrounded. "Hold your ground," McCullough commanded, falling back on his military bearing. "We've got supplies, ammunition, defensible positions. They can't take us without a fight." But even as he spoke, more of Sarah's allies emerged from the storm. Lakota, Warriors appeared like ghosts in the rain, arrows nocked and ready. Buffalo soldiers and U.S. cavalry units formed a ring of steel around the ranch. Marshal Wilson's deputies covered every escape route. Sarah Freeman's voice carried through the darkness, amplified by the storm's acoustics. "Your organization is finished, McCullough. Federal agents are arresting your people across 3 territories. Your network is exposed. Your allies are turning evidence to save themselves." The Devil's response was a rifle shot that kicked up mud near Sarah's position. "You think you've won?" he screamed into the rain. "You're still just a slave playing. At power! These are important men in there. Judges, politicians. They'll never let you destroy what we've built." Inside the ranch house, those important men were already turning on each other. Accusations flew as each tried to shift blame, to bargain, for mercy, to save themselves from the justice bearing down on them. McCullough abandoned them to their panic, moving to the barn where he'd stored emergency supplies. His last plan was desperate. Use dynamite meant for mining claims to create chaos, then slip away in the confusion. He'd escaped Shadow Walker before. He could do it again. But Sarah had anticipated even this. As McCullough entered the barn, he found Thomas Washington waiting, rifle aimed steady. "Looking for these?" the former Buffalo soldier asked, indicating the removed detonators. The Devil went for his gun, but age and exhaustion betrayed him. Washington's rifle butt caught him in the chest, driving him back into the rain. McCullough sprawled in the mud, his legendary reputation dissolving in the storm. Sarah approached on horseback, the Sharp's rifle ready but not aimed. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the tableau. The fallen devil, the freed slave turned federal agent, and all the power of law and justice backing her play. "It's over," she said simply. "The world you fought for in Virginia, the power you tried to build out here, it's finished. The future belongs to all people now, not just men like you." McCullough's hand inched toward his holster one last time. Sarah's voice cut through the rain. "Choose carefully, Devil. Die here in the mud, or live to see everything you built torn. Down by the law." Thunder punctuated her words as McCullough faced his final choice. The storm raged on, washing away the last traces of the old order he'd tried so desperately to preserve. The storm broke just before dawn, clouds parting to reveal a blood-red sunrise over the Cross T Ranch. McCullough knelt in the mud, his last desperate gambit having failed. Around him, Sarah Freeman's coalition of justice had tightened into an unbreakable ring. U.S. cavalry, Lakota warriors, Buffalo soldiers, and territorial lawmen, all united in common cause. From the ranch house came the sounds of surrender, as Marshal Wilson and his deputies took the organization's leadership into custody. Judges who'd terrorized freedmen from the bench now wore iron bracelets. Bankers who'd funded the gang's raids shuffled out in chains. Politicians who'd protected their activities faced federal marshals reading charges of conspiracy and treason. Sarah Freeman sat straight in her saddle despite her wound, the Sharp's rifle across her lap as she watched McCullough's final moments of freedom. "You're right about one thing, Devil," she said, her voice carrying in the dawn stillness. "I was a slave. I scrubbed floors while you wore a colonel's stars. I picked cotton while you gave orders. I lived in chains while you lived in luxury." She dismounted, boots squelching in the mud as she approached him. "But that was your mistake, thinking chains could hold a person's spirit, thinking the color of your skin made you superior, thinking your cause was righteous when it was built on other people's pain." McCullough spat, defiance warring with defeat in his eyes. "You think arresting us changes anything? There are thousands more who think like we do. The South lost," Sarah cut him off, "and now you've lost again. But this time you'll face a different kind of justice." She produced a leather folder bearing federal seals. "By the authority of the United States government, you're under arrest for crimes committed during and after the Civil War. Murder, conspiracy, terrorism, violation of federal laws concerning the rights of freed persons. And treason, McCullough. You never stopped fighting the war, never accepted that the Union won. The devil's face twisted. You can't prove... I have proof of everything. Sarah's voice was cold as prairie frost. Every raid, every murder, every corrupt deal, your own documents, testimony from your men, financial records, all gathered over years while you thought I was just another freedwoman seeking fortune in the West. She turned to address the gathered witnesses. This isn't just about one gang or one man. This is about the future of these territories, about whether we build that future on justice or hatred, on equality or terror, on law or violence. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Sarah continued. You tried to stop progress by burning black businesses, by terrorizing success, by corrupting the law itself. But you forgot something crucial, McCullough. You forgot that the human spirit can't be broken by fear, that cooperation is stronger than division, that justice may be delayed, but it comes for all men eventually. As if to punctuate her words, more riders appeared on the horizon, federal marshals bringing news of arrests across the territories. The organization's entire network was being dismantled, its members facing courts that could no longer be bribed or threatened. McCullough made one last, desperate move. He lunged for Sarah, a hidden derringer appearing in his hand. But she'd been ready, been waiting for this final act of violence. The Sharp's rifle came up smooth as silk, its report echoing across the prairie. The devil fell, clutching his shoulder, the derringer spinning away in the mud. The wound was precise, disabling but not fatal. Justice, not vengeance. That's twice now I've shot you, McCullough, Sarah said quietly. Once in Virginia when you tried to hang my friends, and now here when you tried one last time to hold back. The future. Some men never learn. Marshal Wilson approached with heavy iron manacles. These were meant for runaway slaves once, he said as he cuffed McCullough. Seems fitting to use them on you now. The sun climbed higher as federal agents began documenting the scene. Sarah's years of evidence would ensure that not one of the conspirators escaped justice. The organization that had tried to transplant the Confederacy's worst aspects to the West was finished. Swift Horse appeared at Sarah's side. The Shadow Walker becomes the light bringer, he said softly. Your hunt ends as the sun rises. Sarah Freeman looked east, toward the dawn of a new day in the territories. Not an ending, she corrected. A beginning. There's still work to be done, justice to be built, bridges to be made between all peoples. The wound in her shoulder throbbed, but she stood straight and proud. The devil's reign of terror was over, and with it perhaps the last gasps of the old order he'd tried to preserve. 3 months after the storm at Cross T Ranch, Sarah Freeman stood in a packed federal courthouse in St. Louis. McCullough and his conspirators faced justice before a bench that couldn't be bought. Her testimony, backed by years of meticulous evidence, sealed their fate. The devil and his organization would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. But the true victory wasn't in the punishment, it was in the changes that rippled across the territories. The corrupt network's exposure had cleared the way for honest government and equal justice. Black businesses flourished without fear of midnight raids. Native tribes found their treaties suddenly respected by local officials who could no longer be bribed. Marshal Wilson used the lessons learned to reform his entire department. His deputies now included freed slaves and Native Americans, making law enforcement truly representative of the territory's people. The cooperation that had brought down the devil's hand became a model for a new kind of justice. Sarah's trading empire expanded, but with a new purpose. Her routes became highways of opportunity for others seeking their fortune in the West. Former slaves, Native Americans, and white settlers who believed in equality found support and protection under her influence. The Lakota and other tribes who had aided in McCullough's capture gained formal recognition of their rights. Swift Horse became a liaison between native peoples and territorial authorities, building bridges between cultures that the devil had tried to keep divided. Thomas Washington and Marcus Brown established a school for freed children, teaching them not just reading and writing, but the skills needed to succeed in the changing West. The school's first class included black, native, and white students learning side by side. On a cool autumn evening, Sarah sat on her office porch in Kansas City, reading reports from her network, now dedicated to protecting the rights they'd fought to secure. Her shoulder had healed, leaving a scar that served as a reminder of the price of justice. Swift Horse appeared from the gathering dusk, as he often did. "There are rumors," he said, "of other groups trying to follow McCullough's example in Dakota Territory." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "Then we'll stop them too. The path is marked now, the alliance built. Some men are slow to accept that the future belongs to all people." She touched the Sharp's rifle, retired now, but still within reach. Shadow Walker's days of hunting were done, but Sarah Freeman's work continued. The West was changing, growing, into something new. A place where justice might be slow, but was no longer blind to the color of a person's skin. As night fell over the prairie, Sarah looked to the horizon where railroad tracks stretched toward tomorrow. The Devil's Day was done, but the dawn of something better had only just begun, and somewhere in the darkness, both native drums and African songs carried the story of Shadow Walker, the freed slave who brought down the devil and helped build a different kind of West, one story, one victory, one step at a time.